His sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature. It was a redemption.
Imagine standing before something so powerful, so divine, that your human eyes cannot bear to look at it. A face blazing brighter than 1,000 suns, eyes like fire trapped inside crystal, a voice so overwhelming it tears through dimensions and shakes reality itself. This is not the Jesus most of the world has been taught to imagine. This is the Jesus described in the forbidden Ethiopian Bible. Ancient scriptures hidden from the Western world for nearly 2,000 years. And when these chilling words were read aloud from a 1,500-year-old Guise manuscript, even Mel Gibson reportedly went silent before saying, "This changes everything." What did he hear that left him speechless? What truth was buried for centuries? And why were these descriptions erased from the Bible most people know today? Before we uncover this ancient mystery, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear may completely change the way you see Jesus forever. There is a version of the Bible most people have never heard of, a collection of sacred writings that history almost erased from the Western world. Here's what happened. While much of Christianity was deciding which books would be accepted as scripture and which would be cast aside, Ethiopia chose a different path. They kept it all. That's the part almost nobody talks about. Back in the 4th century, church leaders gathered behind closed doors to decide which writings would be declared divinely inspired. The books approved in those meetings became the Bible most people know today. The ones rejected were branded dangerous, removed from circulation, and many were destroyed completely. In the end, only 66 to 73 books remained, depending on the tradition. For centuries, people assumed that was the complete story. It wasn't. Not even close. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, was never part of those decisions. Christianity reached Ethiopia long before it spread across much of Europe. These were not outsiders arriving late to the faith. They were among the earliest followers of Christ anywhere in the world. And because Ethiopia was protected by mountains and deserts, cut off from much of the political struggle reshaping Christianity in Rome, its church developed in near total isolation. While councils in the West debated which texts should survive, Ethiopian monks carefully copied every sacred writing passed down from the earliest believers. Every gospel, every prophecy, every vision, every account connected to Christ. They didn't filter or edit. They preserved. The result was a biblical canon of 81 books, 46 in the Old Testament and 35 in the New, written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language older than Latin, as a liturgical tradition. Hidden within these pages are texts the Western Church completely lost: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Book of the Covenant, and many others. Dr. Ephraim Isaac of Princeton, one of the leading scholars of Guise manuscripts, spent more than 4 decades studying these texts. He once described comparing the Ethiopian canon to the Western Bible as feeling like he had spent his entire life reading a book with half its pages torn out. These are not small additions or historical side notes. These are entire theological worlds that survived in only one place on earth. And what they reveal about Jesus is perhaps the most astonishing part of all. In fact, it's the very thing said to have left Mel Gibson speechless, because the Jesus described in these ancient writings is nothing like the familiar image most of the Western world carries in its mind. Even if you've never opened a Bible, you probably picture him the same way: gentle eyes, soft expression, flowing robes, pale skin, calm and approachable. That image was shaped during the European Renaissance, when artists painted Christ to resemble the people around them, safe, familiar, human. Now erase that picture completely, because the Ethiopian manuscripts describe something radically different, and they do it with shocking clarity. They describe hair radiant like pure wool, flooded with intense light, not simply white in color, but glowing as though alive. His eyes burn like fire, trapped inside crystal, not comforting, but all-seeing. Eyes that pierce through every mask, every lie, every hidden part of the soul we try to conceal. His face shines brighter than 1,000 suns ignited at once, not warm or gentle, but blinding in its intensity. A brilliance so overwhelming that the texts say even angels struggle to look directly upon it. And yet within that terrifying power is a peace beyond comprehension. Not because the force is absent, but because it is so absolute, it has nothing to prove. It is the stillness of something capable of unraveling existence itself and choosing restraint. When he speaks, his voice does not move through air like ordinary sound. It ripples through dimensions. Realms invisible to human perception tremble with each word. When he moves, reality itself responds. The world bends and shifts around him like water disturbed by a stone. Even his silence carries weight. The manuscripts describe his presence as something that alters the very space around it, as though creation itself recognizes who stands before it and rearranges in response. And here's what makes this so unsettling. The Ethiopian texts are not speaking in metaphor. They are not exaggerating for poetic effect. They are describing, as literally as language allows, a being so far beyond human understanding that even the word human feels inadequate. Dr. Getachew Haley, who spent more than 30 years cataloguing Ethiopian manuscripts at the Hill Museum, described his first encounter with these passages as both beautiful and terrifying. He said, "This is not the Jesus of Sunday school. This is something the Western Church either forgot or chose to forget. And this is where things become truly unbelievable. Because when you compare these Ethiopian descriptions to the Book of Revelation, the similarities are impossible to ignore. Feet glowing like bronze refined in fire, a voice crashing like endless waters, a face blazing with the full force of the sun itself. Those exact images appear in Revelation, the final book of the Western Bible, the one apocalyptic text that somehow survived with all of its cosmic imagery untouched. But in the Ethiopian tradition, this isn't some rare vision reserved for the end of Scripture. This is the foundation. This is how Christ is revealed from the beginning. And that changes everything. Because suddenly, the gentle shepherd Western Christianity presents, and the overwhelming cosmic ruler described in Ethiopian scripture feel like two completely different beings. And that divide didn't happen by chance. It was shaped by generations of choices, by people who decided one image of Jesus was easier to understand and easier to control. When Mel Gibson was reportedly shown these side-by-side depictions, the familiar Renaissance portrait beside the Ethiopian descriptions, his reaction was immediate. He said the Western image suddenly looked like a child's sketch trying to capture the power of a nuclear explosion. Familiar, comfortable, but hopelessly incomplete. And if this is already shifting your understanding, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what comes next goes even deeper. Because hidden within Ethiopia's preserved scriptures is a prophecy so impossible, so specific, that it shouldn't exist at all. A prophecy written 300 years before Jesus was ever born. and it comes from one of the most controversial books ever removed from the Bible, the Book of Enoch. What makes Enoch so unsettling isn't simply what it says, it's when it says it. Written centuries before the New Testament, it describes a mysterious figure called the Son of Man, the Chosen One, and the details are astonishing. It speaks of a heavenly throne surrounded by rivers of living fire, of angels collapsing in worship before a radiant being made entirely of light, of a final judgment where every soul is measured before a presence so overwhelming that all creation trembles. These are not vague symbols open to endless interpretation. They are detailed scenes that mirror the visions of Revelation with stunning precision. Descriptions written hundreds of years earlier. Fire pouring from a throne of judgment. Celestial beings unable to raise their eyes. A chosen figure standing at the center of reality itself, speaking with authority so absolute that the guilty collapse while the righteous break into tears of recognition. This connection isn't fringe speculation. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose work on First Enoch is considered definitive, made it clear Revelation did not invent these images. It inherited them from a far older apocalyptic tradition, and at the root of that tradition stands Enoch. The parallels are not coincidence, they are legacy. One vision passed forward across centuries until it surfaced again in the final pages of the New Testament. And here's what makes this even stranger. The early church knew Enoch well. It was quoted, studied, and respected by early Christians. In fact, the Epistle of Jude, still in the Bible today, directly quotes Enoch word for word. Think about that. A book quoted as authoritative scripture inside the Bible was later removed from the Bible itself. That's not a theological accident. That's a decision. And Enoch contains far more than prophecy. It describes the structure of the heavens with details so precise they sound less like mythology and more like someone attempting to explain advanced physics without having the words to do it. It maps celestial movements with mathematical accuracy ancient civilizations weren't supposed to possess. It explores time, evil, cosmic order, and the architecture of existence itself. And if Enoch is even partially accurate, if this ancient vision of a cosmic Christ was truly written centuries before Jesus appeared, then it forces a terrifying question. How did they know? Who gave them that knowledge? And why was this book removed from the version of Scripture most people read today? But as astonishing as Enoch is, it may not even be the strangest text preserved by Ethiopia. Not even close, because another manuscript goes even further. The Ascension of Isaiah. This is the text that changes everything, because it doesn't simply predict Christ. It describes how he entered our world, and not in the way you've always heard. Not the stable, not the manger, not the shepherds or the guiding star. Something far older, far stranger, and far more unsettling. The text describes the prophet Isaiah being taken upward through 7 distinct heavens, not symbolic heavens, not spiritual metaphors, actual layers of reality, stacked one above another, each level more brilliant and incomprehensible than the last. Isaiah describes structures formed of light and sound unlike anything found in human experience, being so radiant that an ordinary person would be destroyed by standing near them. And with every ascent, the intensity grows. The light becomes heavier, almost physical. The voices of the heavenly beings become more layered, more complex, more overwhelming. Isaiah says it felt as if his consciousness itself was being stretched, expanded beyond its natural limits, just to survive what it was witnessing. His mind was being forced to hold realities it was never designed to comprehend. And still, it was barely enough. And at the very highest level, beyond every layer of existence, Isaiah sees the beloved, a presence so overwhelming in light and authority that even the word God feels too small to describe it. Every being in every heaven below immediately bows toward this presence, not because they are commanded to, but because they cannot help it. It happens the way gravity pulls objects downward. It is automatic, absolute, undeniable. And then something impossible happens. The beloved begins to descend. This is where the story becomes truly astonishing, because what happens next feels less like ancient scripture and more like a hidden record of an operation humanity was never meant to uncover. As Christ moves downward through the seven heavens, he deliberately veils his radiance. Layer by layer, he dims his glory, not because he is losing power, but because each lower level of reality would be unable to endure the fullness of his presence. He adjusts himself to the limitations of every dimension he passes through. By the time he reaches the lower heavens, the concealment is so complete that the angels there no longer recognize him. They look directly at him and see nothing extraordinary. Think about that for a moment. The creator of existence is moving through the framework he designed, and the beings who dwell there cannot even perceive who he truly is. And when he finally arrives on earth, as a newborn child in Bethlehem, wrapped in cloth and lying in straw, the disguise is absolute, infinite cosmic power compressed into the body of a helpless infant. According to the text, all of heaven is watching in stunned silence. The angels who failed to recognize him on the way down now stare toward earth in confusion, trying to understand what they missed. And there, in a feeding trough in an insignificant town, the architect of all reality cries for milk. Let that sink in. Forget the polished Sunday school version for a moment and consider the raw story itself. A being powerful enough to shape the structure of reality chooses, out of love and liberation, to reduce himself completely. He descends through 7 dimensions, dimming his glory at every level until he arrives in the weakest and most vulnerable form imaginable. And according to these texts, he did not come to conquer. He did not come to rule. He came to awaken. His mission was never simply to teach morality or model good behavior. It was to break chains, to wake humanity from spiritual sleep, to ignite something inside every person that had been dormant since the beginning. He came not as a king demanding obedience, but as a spark meant to remind humanity of what it truly is. This account existed among believers centuries before church councils decided what Christianity would officially become. The Ethiopian monks did not invent it. They simply refused to erase it. When Mel Gibson reportedly heard this passage read in full, the descent through all 7 heavens, he sat in complete silence for nearly a minute before finally saying, "That's the story the world actually needs to hear." But what Ethiopia preserved about the words of Jesus himself may be even more shocking, because the Ethiopian Bible doesn't just describe Christ differently, it quotes him differently. Hidden within texts like the Book of the Covenant are sayings attributed to Jesus that never appeared in Western scripture, not because they were proven false, not because scholars exposed them as fraudulent. They were simply left out, discarded by those who had the authority to decide what the world would and would not hear. And when you read these words, it becomes immediately clear why they were removed. In one passage, Jesus tells his followers, "You are not made of dust, you are children of light." That single sentence changes everything, because if every human being carries a living fragment of the divine, then the entire religious structure built between humanity and God begins to collapse. The priests, the bishops, the rituals, the hierarchies, the institutions, every system designed to act as a bridge between people and the divine becomes unnecessary. You do not need someone else to connect you to what already exists within you. This is the heart of the Ethiopian teaching. Salvation is not a transaction. It is not a reward handed down by religious authority. It is awakening. The kingdom of heaven is not a distant place waiting after death. According to these texts, it is a state of consciousness available right now, while breathing, while living, while fully present in this body. Not later, not after earning it, now. And you can immediately understand why this message was dangerous, because if God already dwells within every person, then every person becomes their own priest. If heaven is available now, then there is no need to wait for permission, no need to depend on institutions claiming control over something you already possess. These teachings did not simply challenge a few doctrines. They threatened the entire political and economic framework of organized religion. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity in the 4th century, it brought with it an imperial mindset. Unity required control. Control required standardization, and standardization required deciding once and for all which books would remain and which would disappear. Any text teaching direct access to God without institutional mediation was not merely controversial, it was dangerous. So the removals began. The Book of Enoch was excluded. The Ascension of Isaiah was dismissed as apocryphal. The Book of the Covenant was buried. Anything that carried the message of direct awakening, personal divinity, and liberation from hierarchy was quietly stripped away. No public debate, no open explanation, just decisions made behind closed doors by men deciding what the rest of humanity would be allowed to know. And the Christ who emerged from that process was transformed. The cosmic sovereign of fire and light became the gentle shepherd. The voice that shook dimensions became a soft voice of comfort. The awakener sent to liberate humanity became little more than a moral teacher asking people to behave. This was not always deliberate corruption. Often it was something slower, a gradual reshaping of the story into a form more useful to the institution telling it. But Ethiopia remained beyond their reach. Its monasteries were carved into cliffsides, reachable only by rope. Its monks had no interest in Roman politics. They had one purpose: preserve the texts. And for nearly 2,000 years, they did exactly that. Generation after generation, by candlelight, they copied every word by hand, letter by letter, page by page, in a language the outside world eventually forgot how to read. And hidden inside those ancient manuscripts were warnings. Warnings that future generations would create false images of Christ. Warnings that humanity would one day worship the symbol while forgetting the living presence behind it. Warnings that people would cling to the image and lose sight of the reality it was always meant to reveal. They contain warnings. Warnings that people would one day create false images from their own imagination and call those images God. They speak of a time when the truth would be covered over by symbols, when the living reality of Christ would be replaced by something easier to consume and easier to control. A cosmic awakening would slowly be reduced to comfortable morality. Looking at it now, those warnings don't feel like ancient prophecy at all. They feel like a report written 2,000 years ahead of schedule. And even now, at this very moment, those manuscripts still exist. They remain hidden inside stone monasteries, carved directly into the cliffs of Ethiopia. Some can only be reached by climbing a single rope suspended over drops hundreds of feet deep. Inside those ancient walls, monks continue their work exactly as it has been done for centuries. They rise before dawn. They pray until their bodies ache. Then they sit in candlelight and copy these texts by hand, letter by letter, in Ge'ez, a language the outside world forgot long ago. They do not do this for recognition. They do not do it for money. They do it because they believe these words are alive, and because they believe the world will one day come searching for them. 81 books, ancient descriptions of a Christ so radically different from the Western image that when Mel Gibson reportedly encountered them, he said the church of his childhood had given him a version of Jesus with the volume turned almost all the way down. The cosmic sovereign is still there in those pages. The descent through the seven heavens is still there. The teaching that humanity is made of light is still there. Every word removed from the version of Scripture most people know still survives, somewhere right now, preserved inside a monastery carved into stone where few outsiders will ever set foot. And somewhere in that darkness, a monk is bent over parchment, carefully copying the same words his teacher copied, and his teacher before him, unbroken for nearly 2,000 years. He has never heard of the councils that shaped the Western Bible. He does not know what was removed or why. He only knows that he was entrusted with something sacred, and he will protect it until his final breath. And when you really think about it, the only thing that has ever stood between you and these texts is the same thing that has always stood there, a decision made by someone else, long ago, that you were never supposed to read them. If this changed the way you see the Bible, tell me in the comments which revelation shook you the most. Was it the terrifying descriptions of the cosmic Jesus, the descent through the seven heavens, or the teaching that we are not made of dust, but are children of light? I read every comment, and if this opened your eyes, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next video goes even deeper into the forgotten scriptures history tried to erase. And trust me, what comes next changes everything. Click the video on your screen right now.